With trembling hands clutching a crumpled banknote and her late grandfather's pocket watch, Maggie Foster stared up at the dilapidated facade of the Sunrise Diner. She had just spent her last $300 on this forgotten property at a county foreclosure auction, desperate for a chance at a fresh start after losing everything to medical debt and a string of heartbreaking setbacks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Little did she know that hidden beneath the cracked linoleum floor of the abandoned diner lay a Prohibition-Era Speakeasy vault filled with historical artifacts, vintage liquor bottles, and ledgers containing secrets that would thrust her into a high-stakes battle between preservationists, developers, and a powerful family desperate to keep their ancestors' criminal past buried forever. The November rain drummed steadily against the rusted metal roof as Maggie Foster stood in the empty parking lot of what was now her property. The Sunrise Diner loomed before her like a monument to better times, its once proud neon sign now dark and partially broken, the retro 1950s facade now scarred by decades of neglect. Broken windows covered with plywood and weeds, growing through cracks in the concrete, told the story of a once thriving establishment that had fallen into disrepair. In her jacket pocket, the foreclosure deed felt heavier than it should. $300. That's all she'd been able to scrape together after the creditors had finished picking apart what remained of her life. $300 for a 2,500 square foot building that had once been the social heart of Riverdale, now reduced to the price of a budget smartphone. The irony wasn't lost on her. Maggie Foster, who had spent years working as a line cook in diners just like this one, now stood as the owner of an establishment too broken to even serve a cup of coffee. Just 2 years ago, she had been living what anyone would consider a modest but stable life. She had rented a small but cozy one-bedroom apartment in the better part of town, worked full-time at the Blue Plate Diner where customers requested her famous apple pie by name, and even managed to put a little money aside each month in hopes of one day opening her own bakery. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and after growing up in the foster care system, stability and belonging were luxuries Maggie had learned to treasure. Her life had operated on a reliable rhythm, early mornings prepping breakfast service, afternoons baking pies and planning special dinner menus, and evenings spent in her small but cheerful kitchen experimenting with new recipes. On her days off, she volunteered teaching cooking classes at the community center, helping single parents and low-income families learn to prepare nutritious, budget-friendly meals. Her students called her Magic Maggie for her ability to transform the simplest ingredients into something that tasted like it belonged in an upscale restaurant. Maggie had been a fixture in the local farmers market scene, known for her keen eye for quality produce and friendly relationships with the local vendors, who often saved their best items for her. She wasn't wealthy by any standard, but she had built a life rich in community connections and personal satisfaction. In a world that often measured success in dollars and possessions, Maggie had found contentment in simple pleasures and meaningful work. The first sign that her carefully constructed life was about to unravel came on a Tuesday morning in February. Maggie had been experiencing persistent headaches for weeks, but had brushed them off as stress or perhaps needing new glasses. When she suddenly collapsed during the breakfast rush, sending a tray of plates crashing to the floor. Her coworkers insisted on calling an ambulance despite her protests about the cost. The diagnosis came after a battery of tests, a benign brain tumor that, while not cancerous, was growing in a location that made it dangerous if left untreated. The neurosurgeon explained the situation with clinical detachment. Surgery was necessary, followed by a lengthy recovery period during which Maggie would be unable to work. Even with the modest health insurance provided by the diner, the out-of-pocket costs would be substantial. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, Subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maggie had approached the situation with the same practical determination that had carried her through previous hardships. She worked extra shifts to save money before the surgery, filed all the necessary paperwork for medical leave, and researched every possible program that might help with her expenses. Friends and coworkers organized a fundraiser that covered about a quarter of her anticipated costs. It wasn't enough, but it was something, and Maggie was touched by their efforts. The surgery itself had gone well. The tumor was completely removed, and there was no evidence of malignancy. But the recovery proved more complicated than expected. An infection developed, requiring an additional week in the hospital and expensive specialized antibiotics. Physical therapy was needed to address some minor coordination issues that affected her ability to work in a fast-paced kitchen environment. Week by week, the medical bills mounted while Maggie's savings dwindled to nothing. By the time she was medically cleared to return to work 6 months later, the Blue Plate Diner had closed, another victim of the economic downturn that had affected many small businesses in Riverdale. The owners, who had initially promised to hold her position, had been forced to sell the building to a developer planning to convert it into upscale retail space. Maggie found herself not only deep in medical debt, but also unemployed in a town where restaurant jobs were suddenly scarce. She applied for every cooking position within a 50-mile radius, but the timing couldn't have been worse. 3 other local restaurants had closed within months of the Blue Plate, flooding the market with experienced food service workers, all competing for the few remaining jobs. Maggie's medical history made potential employers wary. Nobody said it directly, but she could see the concern in their eyes when she explained the gap in her employment. As her savings disappeared, Maggie was forced to make increasingly difficult choices. She sold her car and started using the unreliable public transportation system. She moved from her comfortable apartment to a shared living situation with 3 roommates. She pawned the few pieces of jewelry she had inherited from her grandmother. Each sacrifice was painful, but necessary for survival. When the final medical bill arrived, demanding payment for the portion not covered by insurance, Maggie had nothing left to give. Collection agencies began calling, their representatives speaking in the carefully scripted language of professional sympathy and non-negotiable payment schedules. Despite taking on part-time work at a convenience store and weekend shifts at a fast food restaurant, Maggie couldn't keep up with the minimum payments on her medical debt. She had been living in a rundown motel for 3 weeks when she saw the auction listing for the Sunrise Diner. The motel charged $230 per week for a room that smelled of mildew and industrial cleaning products, with paper-thin walls that transmitted every argument and late-night television program from the neighboring rooms. Maggie lay awake each night, calculating how long her remaining resources would last, watching the digital clock count down the hours until she would have nothing left. The diner had been listed in the county's distressed property section alongside foreclosed houses, abandoned commercial buildings, and vacant lots where businesses had once thrived. Most of the listings were far beyond Maggie's reach. Properties that sold for a few thousand might as well have been million-dollar mansions given her current financial reality. But the Sunrise Diner was different. It had been on the market for over a year with no bidders. The county was clearly desperate to get it off their books, with the minimum bid set at just $300. Maggie had exactly $328 in her checking account, the remnants of her last paycheck minus 3 weeks of motel fees and basic living expenses. She'd spent hours researching the property online, reading historical articles about its founding and operation. The Sunrise Diner had been built in 1952 by Harold Jenkins, a World War II veteran who had returned from Europe with dreams of creating a gathering place for the growing community of Riverdale. The classic stainless steel diner with its distinctive curved roof and large windows had quickly become a local institution, serving everything from early morning breakfast to late-night coffee for shift workers. For nearly 70 years, the diner had operated successfully, serving as both a reliable place for good, affordable food and a social center for the surrounding community. It had hosted everything from first dates to business meetings, high school celebrations to retirement parties. Generations of families had slid into its vinyl booths for Sunday brunch after church, and countless truckers had stopped for coffee along their routes. The diner had closed permanently in 2020, a victim of the economic devastation that had doomed similar establishments across the country. The county had seized it for unpaid taxes in 2021 after the owner declared bankruptcy and disappeared, reportedly moving to Florida to live with his sister. Maggie had driven past the building twice before the auction, each time feeling a complex mixture of attraction and trepidation. Even in its current state of decay, she could see the architectural bones that had made it a classic example of mid-century diner design. The stainless steel exterior, though tarnished and dented, still captured the optimistic post-war aesthetic that had defined a generation. The large windows, though some were cracked or boarded over, spoke of a time when diners were designed to be seen from the street, welcoming beacons for hungry travelers and locals alike. The auction itself had been sparsely attended, just Maggie and 2 other bidders, one of whom left after discovering that the winning bidder would be responsible for bringing the building up to current health and safety codes. The auctioneer, a bored-looking man in his 60s, had rattled through the property details with the enthusiasm of someone reading a grocery list. "Structural issues throughout," he'd announced, reading from a prepared statement. "Commercial kitchen equipment removed or damaged beyond repair. Electrical system hasn't been updated since the 1980s. Plumbing issues in multiple areas. Buyer assumes all responsibility for code compliance and any environmental remediation that may be required." Maggie had bid anyway. When the hammer fell, and she was declared the winning bidder, she felt a strange mixture of elation and terror. She owned something again, a building, a piece of real estate, a place where she could legally exist without paying weekly motel fees. The fact that it was uninhabitable and potentially dangerous seemed secondary to the simple reality that she would have a roof over her head. Now standing in the rain outside what was now her property, Maggie wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The diner looked even more intimidating up close, its boarded windows like closed eyes on a face that had seen better days. As she approached the heavy glass doors, original 1950s craftsmanship, she noted with her cook's appreciation for quality, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced in months: possibility. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, surprising her. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the vacant interior, and Maggie stepped inside, fumbling for a light switch. When the overhead fixtures flickered to life with a dim, unsteady glow, she caught her breath. The main dining area stretched before her, a classic diner layout with a long counter and stools on one side, booths lining the opposite wall, and tables in between. Despite the dust and debris that covered every surface, Maggie could immediately see the potential. The black and white checkered floor, though cracked and stained in places, was still intact in most areas. The red vinyl upholstery on the booths was faded and torn, but had that authentic vintage look that designer restaurants now tried to replicate. Behind the counter, the kitchen area was in worse shape. Most of the major appliances had been removed, leaving behind only the built-in elements: stainless steel countertops, empty spaces where grills and fryers had once stood, and wall-mounted shelving units. But the bones were good: commercial-grade ventilation systems, proper drainage in the floors, and enough space for an efficient kitchen workflow. Maggie pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight, exploring deeper into the diner's interior. Beyond the main dining area, she found a small office with a vintage desk still in place, storage rooms with empty shelving units, and what had clearly been a staff break room with lockers still mounted on the walls. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was no sign of serious structural damage or the kind of problems that would make renovation impossible. Most promising of all, Maggie discovered an apartment on the second floor that had obviously served as the owner's residence. Harold Jenkins, in his practical wisdom, had recognized that a serious diner required round-the-clock attention and had designed living quarters that would allow the proprietor to literally live above the business. The apartment was small but efficiently designed. A living room, kitchen, bedroom, and bathroom, all with large windows that overlooked the town. The furniture was gone, but the built-in features remained. Hardwood floors that still gleamed under their coating of dust, built-in bookshelves, and kitchen cabinets that, while dated, appeared to be functional. Maggie stood in the apartment's main room, imagining how it could look with some cleaning and basic repairs. For the first time since her health crisis began, she allowed herself to think beyond mere survival. She could live here. She could make this space a home while figuring out her next steps. Maybe she could even find a way to restore part of the diner, to bring some small portion of its original purpose back to life. It wouldn't be easy, and it would require resources she didn't currently have, but it was a direction, a goal beyond simply making it through another day. Maggie's phone rang as she stood by the living room window, watching rain cascade down glass that hadn't been cleaned in years. The caller ID showed Riverdale High School, her former part-time employer, where she had taught weekend cooking classes before her surgery. "Maggie Foster speaking," she answered, keeping her voice steady. "Maggie, it's Principal Adams. I heard through the grapevine that you'd made a rather unusual purchase. Something about buying the old Sunrise Diner at auction?" "I did," Maggie replied, surprised by the pride she heard in her own voice. "I'm standing in it right now, actually." There was a pause filled with the kind of silence that spoke volumes. "The abandoned diner? Maggie, is everything all right? That building's been empty for years. Surely you can't be planning to live there." What she didn't tell him was that her financial ruin had made her virtually unemployable in positions requiring credit checks or proof of stable housing. What she didn't mention was that Principal Adams himself had been forced to eliminate her teaching position due to budget cuts, effectively cutting off one of her few remaining sources of income. "I'm exploring new opportunities," Maggie said diplomatically. "The property has historical significance and architectural value. It has potential." "Well," Adams said, and she could hear the condescension creeping into his voice, "when you're ready to return to practical employment, let me know. The adult education program might have some openings next semester. Something more suitable for your current situation. From respected cooking instructor to charity case in less than a year." After ending the call, Maggie leaned against the apartment's kitchen counter and let the anger wash over her. Anger at the healthcare system that had bankrupted her, at the economic forces that had eliminated her job, at the cruel arithmetic of American life that could reduce a hard-working person to homelessness in the space of a medical diagnosis. But beneath the anger was something else: determination. She had lost everything that had defined her old life, but she wasn't dead. She still had her skills, her knowledge, her ability to work and learn and grow. She had survived the worst year of her life and emerged with her integrity intact. If she could navigate the maze of medical bills and unemployment, she could certainly figure out how to restore a neglected diner. The rain continued to beat against the windows as Maggie made her way back downstairs to continue exploring her new home. As she crossed the main dining area, her weight caused one of the cracked floor tiles to shift slightly underfoot. Maggie paused, testing the area with her foot. The tile moved again, revealing a gap underneath that seemed deeper than would be expected for simple subflooring. Curious, Maggie knelt down and pried at the loose tile with her fingers. It came away easily, revealing what appeared to be a hollow space beneath. Intrigued, she removed several more surrounding tiles, uncovering what was unmistakably a trapdoor built into the floor, its existence concealed by the diner's checkered linoleum. The trapdoor was secured with a rusted padlock that broke easily when Maggie applied pressure with a screwdriver she found in the kitchen. Her heart racing with the thrill of discovery, she lifted the heavy wooden door to reveal a steep staircase descending into darkness. Using her phone's flashlight, Maggie could see that the stairs led to some kind of basement or cellar, a space that hadn't been mentioned in any of the property listings or auction documentation. Taking a deep breath, Maggie began to descend the stairs, testing each step carefully to ensure it would hold her weight. The wooden steps creaked but seemed solid enough, leading down about 15 feet to a concrete floor below. As she reached the bottom and swept her flashlight around the space, Maggie gasped in astonishment. She wasn't looking at a simple storage cellar or utility room. She was standing in what was unmistakably a Prohibition-Era Speakeasy, a secret bar designed to serve alcohol during the years when it was illegal in the United States. The space was large, at least 1,000 square feet, and remarkably well preserved. A long wooden bar ran along one wall, its surface dusty but intact, with ornate mirrors behind it reflecting the beam of her flashlight. Wooden tables and chairs were arranged throughout the room, looking as though the last patrons had simply stood up and left decades ago. Behind the bar, shelves still held dozens of bottles, some empty, others still sealed with their original contents. Glass cabinets displayed vintage cocktail glasses, decanters, and bar tools. In one corner stood an upright piano, its keys yellowed with age but appearing otherwise undamaged. The walls were decorated with faded photographs and framed newspaper clippings, all dating from the 1920s and early 1930s. As Maggie explored further, she discovered additional rooms branching off from the main space, a small kitchen, storage areas filled with wooden crates, and what appeared to be a private office or counting room with a large safe still secured in one corner. The most astonishing find was a room containing a small copper still, obviously used for producing moonshine during the Prohibition years. On a desk in the office, Maggie found leather-bound ledgers containing detailed records of the speakeasy's operations, inventory lists, financial records, and most intriguingly, names of customers and their preferred drinks. Many of the names were followed by notations that appeared to be coded references to their social standing or political connections. With trembling hands, Maggie opened one of the ledgers to a random page and read entries dating from September 1928. The handwriting was neat and precise, recording transactions that would have been entirely illegal at the time. As she flipped through the pages, she began to recognize names, not just any names, but those of Riverdale's founding families, politicians, police officers, and judges. These weren't simply records of a criminal enterprise. They were documentation of a social network that had shaped the town's development through generations of influence and power. In a moment of clarity, Maggie understood that she had discovered something far more valuable than just a historic curiosity. She had found evidence of the hidden history of Riverdale, a history that certain powerful families might prefer to remain buried. The implications were both exciting and terrifying. What she held in her hands could be worth a significant amount of money to collectors and historians, but it could also make her a target for those whose ancestors' reputations might be damaged by these revelations. As Maggie continued to explore the underground space, she found newspaper clippings that helped piece together the story. The building that eventually became the Sunrise Diner had originally been constructed in 1918 as a legitimate restaurant called the Riverdale Cafe. During Prohibition, the owner, one Thomas Sullivan, had converted the basement into an illegal bar accessible only through the hidden trapdoor. When Prohibition ended in 1933, the speakeasy had apparently been closed up and forgotten, with the above-ground business continuing as a normal restaurant. The most surprising discovery came when Maggie found a photograph of Thomas Sullivan standing proudly behind his bar. The face looking back at her was unmistakably similar to images she had seen of Harold Jenkins, the supposed founder of the Sunrise Diner in 1952. It appeared that Jenkins, or Sullivan, had simply reinvented himself and his business after the war, building the diner on top of his former speakeasy, while maintaining the secret of what lay beneath. As Maggie climbed back up the stairs to the diner level, her mind was racing with questions and possibilities. She had come to this place, seeking nothing more than affordable shelter, a roof over her head, while she figured out how to rebuild her shattered life. Instead, she had stumbled upon a historical treasure trove that could change everything, not just for her, but for the entire town of Riverdale. The rain continued to drum against the diner's roof as Maggie carefully replaced the trapdoor and slid the broken tiles back into position to conceal it, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. She had no way of knowing that by morning, her discovery would attract the attention of people with significant resources and dangerous motivations, people who would stop at nothing to keep certain historical secrets buried forever. All she knew was that for the first time since her medical crisis began, she felt truly alive, connected to a purpose larger than her own survival. The woman who had lost everything was about to discover that sometimes our greatest losses lead us to our most important destinies. And sometimes when we think we have nothing left to lose, we're exactly where we need to be to change the world. Maggie woke to the sound of rain pattering against the tall windows of her new bedroom. The gentle rhythm felt oddly comforting after months of listening to the harsh sounds of traffic and arguing neighbors at the Sunset Motel. For a moment, she lay still, adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings and the strange reality that she now lived above an abandoned diner. The events of the previous day, the discovery of the speakeasy, the ledgers filled with names of Riverdale's elite, the historical treasure trove hidden beneath decades of ordinary business operations seemed almost dreamlike in the soft morning light. But the hidden room was real, and so was the growing certainty that her purchase of this building had uncovered secrets that powerful people might prefer to keep buried. Maggie knew she needed to learn much more about the diner's history and Thomas Sullivan's activities before deciding how to handle her discovery. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar from her meager supplies, Maggie settled at the kitchen table with her laptop, determined to conduct a thorough investigation into the Sunrise Diner's past. She started with Harold Jenkins, the supposed founder, searching for biographical information, newspaper articles, and business records that might shed light on his connection to Thomas Sullivan and the speakeasy. What she found painted a picture of a fascinating and complex figure who had carefully crafted his public identity. Born in 1898, Thomas Sullivan had emigrated from Ireland as a young man, arriving in Riverdale in 1916 with little more than ambition and a talent for cooking. He had opened the Riverdale Cafe in 1918, establishing it as a respectable dining establishment that catered to the town's growing population. When Prohibition began in 1920, Sullivan, like many restaurant owners, had faced a difficult choice: follow the law and potentially lose his business, or find ways to adapt to the new reality. The newspaper archives showed that the Riverdale Cafe had remained open throughout Prohibition, ostensibly serving only food and non-alcoholic beverages. There were occasional mentions of Sullivan in local society pages, describing him as a popular host and friend to many of Riverdale's prominent citizens. Reading between the lines, Maggie could see the subtle hints at his underground activities. Then, in 1931, Sullivan had disappeared from Riverdale without explanation. The Ginu Cafe closed abruptly, with newspaper accounts suggesting he had returned to his homeland due to family matters. There was no further mention of Thomas Sullivan in any local records until after World War II, when Harold Jenkins appeared in Riverdale in 1949. purchasing the property that had once housed the Riverdale Cafe. Jenkins claimed to be a war veteran who had served in Europe, though Maggie could find no military records to verify this. His physical description and business permit applications matched photographs she had found of Thomas Sullivan, allowing for the passage of 2 decades. The timing made perfect sense. Sullivan had likely left town as Prohibition was ending, perhaps because his illegal activities had attracted unwanted attention, and returned years later with a new identity after enough time had passed for memories to fade. The Sunrise Diner had opened in 1952 to immediate success. Local newspaper articles described Jenkins as a natural host, with a gift for making everyone feel welcome, the same qualities attributed to Sullivan years earlier. The diner had quickly become a community institution, with Jenkins as its beloved proprietor until his retirement in 1978. He had died in 1982, leaving the business to his son, Robert Jenkins, who had operated it until 2005 before selling to the final owner, who eventually lost it to foreclosure. Maggie's phone rang, interrupting her research. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar local number. "Hello?" She answered cautiously. "Ms. Foster? This is Frank Wilson from Wilson Development Group." The voice was smooth, professional, with the kind of confidence that suggested someone accustomed to getting his way. "I understand you recently purchased the Sunrise Diner property." Maggie's grip tightened on the phone. How had word of her purchase traveled so quickly? And why would a developer be calling her about it? "Yes, I bought the building at auction yesterday," Maggie replied carefully. "May I ask how you heard about it?" "Riverdale's a small town, Miss Foster. News travels fast when historic properties change hands," Wilson said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I specialize in redeveloping commercial properties in the downtown area. We've had our eye on the Sunrise location for some time. It's a key piece in our revitalization plan for that block." "What kind of revitalization?" Maggie asked immediately. "Suspicious. We're looking to transform that entire section into a modern retail and dining district. The old diner location would make an excellent upscale coffee shop or wine bar. I'd be happy to make you a very generous offer, significantly more than you paid at auction. It would be a quick and profitable transaction for you." The offer sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about Wilson's tone suggested more urgency than a casual business inquiry would warrant. Maggie decided to play it safe. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Wilson, but I'm not interested in selling right now. I have my own plans for the property." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand you might be attached to the idea of owning the diner, Ms. Foster, but renovating a property like that requires significant resources. The building needs extensive work to meet current codes. It might be wiser to take a profit now and pursue something more manageable." The condescension in his voice was unmistakable. "I'll keep that in mind," Maggie said coolly. "But my decision stands. At least let me stop by to discuss it in person," Wilson pressed. "I can show you our plans for the area and explain why this would be beneficial for everyone involved." "That won't be necessary," Maggie replied. "But thank you for your interest." After ending the call, Maggie sat at the kitchen table, feeling deeply unsettled. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Less than 24 hours after discovering the speakeasy, a developer was calling to offer to buy the property. Either word of her discovery had somehow leaked, or Frank Wilson's interest in the diner predated her purchase for reasons she couldn't yet understand. Maggie returned to the trapdoor in the main dining area, carefully removing the loose tiles. To access the speakeasy below, she needed to document everything thoroughly before deciding her next steps. Using her phone, she photographed the entire underground space, the bar, the furnishings, the bottles, and most importantly, the ledgers containing names and transaction records. As she examined the ledgers more carefully in daylight filtering through small basement windows, Maggie noticed something she'd missed the night before. Among the frequent customers listed was a name that appeared in nearly every entry from 1924 to 1930. Richard Wilson, always ordering expensive imported scotch, and often accompanied by various public officials. With a jolt of recognition, Maggie realized this must be Frank Wilson's grandfather or great-grandfather. Further examination of the ledgers revealed that Richard Wilson had been more than just a customer. Notations in the margins indicated financial transactions beyond drink purchases, large sums changing hands, references to protection and investments. It appeared that Wilson had been a silent partner in the speakeasy operation, possibly providing capital and political connections to keep the illegal business running smoothly. Most significantly, Maggie found entries from late 1930 that suggested a dispute between Sullivan and Wilson. The notations became terse and cryptic, with references to disagreement over terms and unreasonable demands. The final entry mentioning Wilson, dated January 1931, simply stated, "R.W. threatens exposure, must reconsider position." Within weeks of that entry, Thomas Sullivan had disappeared from Riverdale, and the cafe had closed. The timeline aligned perfectly with newspaper accounts Maggie had found earlier. It seemed likely that Wilson had forced Sullivan out of town through some form of blackmail or threat, perhaps taking control of the speakeasy's profits in the process. The connection to Frank Wilson's sudden interest in the property became clear. If his family had been involved in illegal activities during Prohibition, the ledgers could potentially damage their reputation. The Wilsons were now one of Riverdale's most prominent families, with business interests throughout the region and a carefully cultivated image of civic leadership and philanthropy. Evidence of their criminal beginnings would be embarrassing. At best, potentially devastating to their business interests at worst. Maggie's phone buzzed with a text message from the unknown number she now recognized as Frank Wilson's. "Ms. Foster, I strongly urge you to reconsider my offer. Old buildings often hide structural problems that aren't immediately apparent. For your own safety and financial security, selling now would be the wisest course. I can have paperwork drawn up immediately and funds transferred by tomorrow." The message felt more like a threat than a business proposition. Maggie realized that her window for careful consideration was rapidly closing. Wilson clearly knew or suspected what might be hidden beneath the diner, and his persistence suggested he wouldn't take no for an answer for long. Maggie spent the rest of the afternoon researching the Wilson family's history in Riverdale. What she found confirmed her suspicions. Richard Wilson had indeed been a prominent businessman in the 1920s, operating a construction company that had won numerous municipal contracts despite being a relatively new enterprise. After Prohibition ended, Wilson Construction had expanded rapidly, securing projects throughout the region with surprising ease. By the 1950s, the Wilson family had diversified into real estate development, banking, and local politics. Richard's son, George Wilson, had served 2 terms as mayor in the 1960s, during which time the family's business interests had flourished with favorable zoning decisions and tax incentives. Frank Wilson, Richard's grandson, now headed the family empire, with a carefully crafted public image as a civic-minded businessman committed to Riverdale's economic development. The family's rise to prominence had begun exactly when Thomas Sullivan disappeared from Riverdale, a coincidence that seemed increasingly significant given the evidence in the speakeasy ledgers. Maggie wondered how many of the Wilson family's early opportunities had been secured through blackmail, using knowledge of who had frequented Sullivan's illegal establishment. As evening approached, Maggie found herself checking the windows frequently, watching for signs of surveillance or unwanted visitors. She noticed a black SUV driving slowly past the diner multiple times, finally parking across the street where the driver had a clear view of the building's entrance. The vehicle matched the description of cars she'd seen in photographs of the Wilson Development Group's fleet on their website. Maggie decided she needed expert advice from someone she could trust. She spent an hour researching historical preservation, experts and local historians, looking for someone with knowledge of Prohibition-era sites who could help her understand the significance of her discovery and advise her on the most ethical way to proceed. Dr. Eleanor Martinez at Riverdale Community College appeared to be exactly what Maggie needed. Martinez was a respected historian who had published extensively on the social history of prohibition in small American towns. Her recent work included a book on speakeasies and their role in shaping community power structures, precisely the context Maggie needed to understand the implications of Sullivan's ledgers. More importantly, Dr. Martinez had a reputation for community activism and had publicly opposed several of Wilson Development Group's projects that threatened historic buildings. If anyone could be trusted to handle Maggie's discovery responsibly, it would be someone with Martinez's credentials and principles. Maggie composed a careful email to Dr. Martinez, explaining her situation in general terms without revealing specific details about the speakeasy or its location. She described herself as someone who had recently acquired a property with potential historical significance related to prohibition and was seeking advice about proper protocols for documentation and preservation. After sending the email, Maggie felt slightly less isolated with her dilemma. Whatever decisions she ultimately made about the speakeasy and its contents, she would at least have input from a qualified expert who understood both the historical significance and the complex power dynamics involved. As she prepared for her second night in the diner, Maggie took additional precautions to secure the building. She checked all doors and windows, using tools from the maintenance closet to reinforce the most vulnerable entry points. The black SUV remained parked across the street, its presence a constant reminder that Frank Wilson was not likely to give up easily. Maggie's phone pinned with an email notification. Dr. Martinez had responded already, expressing immediate interest in Maggie's discovery and suggesting they meet the following morning. The historian's enthusiasm was evident even in her brief message. Ms. Foster, your email comes at a fascinating time. I've been researching Prohibition-era establishments in Riverdale for years, with particular interest in the connections between illegal alcohol distribution and current power structures in our community. If you've indeed found evidence related to this period, it could be historically significant. I would be happy to meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss your discovery in confidence. Until then, I strongly advise you to document everything thoroughly and avoid discussing your findings with others, particularly anyone associated with local development interests. The email concluded with Dr. Martinez's phone number and a request that Maggie contact her immediately if she felt concerned about the security of the site or materials. Reassured by the prompt and supportive response, Maggie returned to the speakeasy for one final exploration before sealing it for the night. As she moved through the underground space, she noticed details she had missed during her earlier excitement: a small door in the back wall, partially concealed behind wooden crates. Using her phone's flashlight, Maggie made her way to the door and found it secured with a simple sliding bolt. When she opened it, she discovered a narrow tunnel extending about 30 feet before ending at a ladder that led upward to what appeared to be another trapdoor. This must have been the speakeasy's emergency exit, allowing patrons to escape during raids by prohibition agents. Climbing the ladder cautiously, Maggie pushed against the trapdoor and found it opened into an alley behind what was now a vacant storefront adjacent to the diner. The exit was cleverly disguised as an ordinary cellar door, the kind that would have attracted no attention during the building's active years. This discovery provided Maggie with something invaluable: an alternative escape route should Frank Wilson's people attempt to enter the diner forcibly. Back in the main speakeasy room, Maggie decided to gather the most important historical evidence. For safekeeping, she carefully packed the ledgers, several key photographs, and a sample of the sealed liquor bottles into a waterproof container she found in the storage area. These items represented the core of her discovery, the documentation that connected Riverdale's current power brokers to their illicit past. As she secured the container, Maggie heard a concerning sound from above, the distinctive crunch of footsteps on broken glass. Someone was inside the diner. Moving quickly but quietly, Maggie extinguished her phone's light and listened intently. Multiple sets of footsteps moved across the main dining area, directly above the speakeasy. A man's voice, authoritative and familiar from their phone conversation, spoke clearly enough for Maggie to hear through the thin floor ceiling. "Check every inch of this place. The county records show no basement or cellar, but that doesn't mean there isn't one. These old buildings often have undocumented features. I want to know if there's anything beneath this floor before we proceed with acquisition." Frank Wilson had apparently decided that waiting for Maggie's cooperation was no longer necessary. The sound of furniture being moved and floorboards being tested made it clear that his team was conducting a thorough search for the entrance to the speakeasy. Maggie's heart raced as she realized her precarious position. If they found the trapdoor, she would be cornered in the speakeasy with no explanation for her presence there. Moving as silently as possible, she gathered her container of evidence and made her way to the emergency tunnel, sliding the bolt closed behind her. As she navigated the narrow passage, Maggie could hear the muffled sounds of the search continuing above. The team seemed to be moving methodically through the diner, tapping on floors and examining walls for hidden spaces. It would only be a matter of time before they discovered the loose tiles concealing the trapdoor. Maggie reached the ladder and climbed carefully, balancing the container of evidence as she ascended. The alley trapdoor opened with a soft creak, allowing her to slip out into the night undetected. Rain had begun to fall again, providing additional cover as Maggie closed the cellar door and made her way through back streets away from the diner. She needed a safe place to store the evidence and to spend the night, somewhere Frank Wilson wouldn't think to look for her. The most obvious choice was Dr. Martinez, but Maggie hesitated to involve the historian before their scheduled meeting. Instead, she thought of the public library, a 24-hour facility with study rooms that could provide temporary sanctuary while she formulated a plan. The Riverdale Public Library was a grand Carnegie building that had been modernized inside while preserving its historic exterior. At this late hour, only a few students occupied the main reading room, with a single librarian staffing the circulation desk. Maggie found an unoccupied study room in the back corner of the building and settled in with her container of evidence. Under the bright library lights, she examined the ledgers more carefully, focusing on entries related to Richard Wilson and his associates. The picture that emerged was far more complex than she had initially realized. Wilson hadn't merely been a customer or silent partner. He had used the speakeasy as a networking hub to build his business empire, leveraging the illegal establishment to gather information and make connections that would have been impossible in more public settings. Names of judges, police officials, competing business owners, and political figures appeared throughout the ledgers, each with notations about their preferences, weaknesses, and potential usefulness. Thomas Sullivan had recorded everything meticulously, creating what amounted to a detailed map of Riverdale's power structure during the Prohibition era. Most damning were entries documenting apparent bribes to public officials' cash payments, recorded under the euphemism of special reserves or aged selections. These transactions had increased in frequency and amount as Wilson Construction began securing municipal contracts in the late 1920s. Maggie realized she was holding not just historically interesting documents, but evidence of the corrupt foundation upon which the Wilson family had built their empire. If made public, these records could potentially trigger investigations into how the family had obtained their initial wealth and connections, devastating prospect for a business that relied heavily on public contracts and political goodwill. No wonder Frank Wilson was so determined to acquire the diner property. He must have known or suspected what lay beneath it, perhaps through family stories or documents, or simply through awareness that his grandfather had been involved with Sullivan's operation. Either way, his aggressive pursuit now made perfect sense. As midnight approached, Maggie's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Miss Foster? This is Dr. Eleanor Martinez. I hope I'm not calling too late, but I've been doing some research since receiving your email, and I believe I understand what you may have found. Are you somewhere safe right now?" Surprised by the historian's intuition, Maggie explained her current situation, the intrusion at the diner, her escape with the evidence, and her temporary refuge at the library. "Stay where you are," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "I'm coming to meet you. What you've found may be even more significant than you realize. The connections between Prohibition-era criminal enterprises and Riverdale's current power structure have been the focus of my research for years, but I've lacked concrete evidence. If what you're describing is authentic, it could change our understanding of the town's entire development." While waiting for Dr. Martinez to arrive, Maggie continued examining the materials she had salvaged. Beyond the ledgers, the photographs provided visual evidence of the speakeasy's operations, images of Sullivan behind the bar, customers enjoying illegal drinks, and most significantly, several clear pictures of Richard Wilson in conversation with uniformed police officers and men in expensive suits who appeared to be local officials. One photograph in particular caught Maggie's attention. Richard Wilson, shaking hands with a man identified in Sullivan's handwriting as Judge Harold Barker, with both men smiling as they held up glasses of scotch. 2 weeks after the date. On this photograph, according to newspaper archives Maggie had researched earlier, Judge Barker had dismissed a lawsuit against Wilson Construction for allegedly using substandard materials in a municipal building project. The connections were becoming increasingly clear and increasingly damning. What had begun as a desperate purchase of an abandoned diner for basic shelter had led Maggie to uncover the corrupt origins of Riverdale's most powerful family, a discovery that could potentially upend the town's entire power structure. As Maggie carefully replaced the materials in their container, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She had lost everything that had defined her old existence: her health, her job, her home, her financial security. Yet those losses had positioned her to make a discovery that might never have happened otherwise. The desperate woman who had spent her last $300 on a dilapidated diner was now the custodian of historical truth that powerful people had worked for generations to conceal. The sound of the library door opening announced Dr. Martinez's arrival. As the historian approached, Maggie prepared to share her findings, knowing that whatever happened next would not only determine her own future, but potentially reshape the future of Riverdale itself. The journey that had begun with medical bankruptcy and personal loss was evolving into something far larger than her individual struggle, a chance to expose long-buried corruption and perhaps bring a measure of justice to a community shaped by hidden powers. The woman who had lost everything was about to discover that sometimes our greatest losses lead us not to further despair, but to opportunities for truth and transformation that we could never have imagined in more comfortable times. Dr. Eleanor Martinez rushed into the library study room, her eyes widening at the sight of the materials spread across the table. A petite woman in her 50s with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, she carried herself with the confident authority of someone accustomed to academic respect. She wore jeans and a hastily buttoned blouse under a rain jacket, clearly having left home in a hurry after Maggie's call. "Miss Foster?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'm Eleanor Martinez. Thank you for contacting me." Maggie rose to shake the historian's hand. "Thank you for coming so quickly, especially at this hour." Dr. Martinez's gaze was already fixed on the ledgers and photographs. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward the materials. Maggie nodded, watching as the historian carefully examined. The first ledger, her expression shifting from professional interest to barely contained excitement as she turned the pages. "These are extraordinary," Dr. Martinez whispered after several minutes of silent examination. "Absolutely extraordinary. Do you understand what you've found?" "I think so," Maggie replied. Records of an illegal speakeasy operated by Thomas Sullivan, who later became Harold Jenkins and opened the Sunrise Diner, and evidence that Richard Wilson, ancestor of Frank Wilson from Wilson Development, was deeply involved in the operation and used it to build his business through corrupt connections. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. "Yes, but it's even more significant than that. For years, I've been researching how Prohibition reshaped the power structures of small American towns. There's been a theory among historians that many of today's prominent families built their wealth and influence through illegal activities during that period, but concrete evidence has been almost impossible to find. Most speakeasy operators destroyed their records when Prohibition ended, fearing legal consequences." She carefully turned the pages of the ledger. "What you've discovered is a complete and meticulously documented record of how criminal enterprises during Prohibition transformed into legitimate businesses afterward, showing exactly how illegal profits were laundered into respectable ventures, and how relationships formed in speakeasies translated into business advantages." The historian pointed to specific entries. "Look here, Richard Wilson paying Judge Barker's tab weekly. Then 2 months later, Wilson Construction mysteriously winning the bid for the courthouse expansion, despite being a new company with no major project experience. And here, Police Chief Morgan receiving special reserve payments, followed by multiple raids on competing speakeasies, while Sullivan's operation remained untouched." Maggie felt a chill as she realized the full implications. So the Wilson family's entire empire is built on corruption? "Based on these records, it certainly appears that way," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "And not just the Wilsons. These ledgers implicate at least a dozen families still prominent in Riverdale: judges, lawyers, politicians, business owners. This explains why certain families have maintained their grip on power for generations, despite changing economic conditions." The historian looked up from the documents, her expression grave. "Frank Wilson's interest in your property makes perfect sense now. These records could potentially trigger investigations into the foundation of his family's wealth, not to mention damaging their carefully cultivated public image." "So what should I do?" Maggie asked. "I bought that diner just looking for a place to live after medical bills bankrupted me. I never expected to become the keeper of historical secrets that could upend the town's power structure." Dr. Martinez considered the question carefully. "First, we need to ensure these materials are properly preserved and protected. I can help with that. The college has facilities for handling historical documents. Second, we need legal advice about the ownership status of these artifacts and the potential implications of making them public." She paused, studying Maggie's face. "But most importantly, you need to understand that Frank Wilson won't stop pursuing this. If he was willing to break into your property tonight, he'll take other steps to acquire or destroy these materials. Your safety could be at risk." Maggie felt her stomach tighten. "I can't go back to the diner, can I?" "Not tonight, certainly," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "You can stay at my place. I have a guest room, and my house has a security system. Tomorrow, we can contact some colleagues I trust and develop a plan for handling both the historical materials and your situation." As they gathered the documents and prepared to leave the library, Maggie's phone buzzed with another text from Frank Wilson. "Miss Foster, my team reports that you've left the property with certain items of interest. I strongly advise returning them immediately. These materials have significant liability issues, and possessing them could create legal complications for you. I'm prepared to overlook tonight's misunderstanding and still offer a generous price for the property if everything is returned intact by morning." Dr. Martinez read the message over Maggie's shoulder and shook her head. Classic intimidation. Tactics. He's trying to frighten you with vague legal threats while still dangling financial incentives. Notice he doesn't specify what items he's referring to. He doesn't want to put anything incriminating in writing. They drove to Dr. Martinez's home in separate cars, taking a circuitous route to ensure they weren't followed. The historian lived in a modest craftsman bungalow in an older neighborhood, surrounded by mature trees and well-maintained gardens. Inside, the house was filled with books, artifacts, and the comfortable clutter of an academic's life. After settling Maggie in the guest room, Dr. Martinez brewed tea, and they sat at the kitchen table to discuss their options. There are several ways we could approach this, the historian explained. We could go public immediately, contact the State Historical Society, the media, and relevant academic journals. That would create immediate protection through publicity, but it would also trigger an aggressive response from the Wilsons and others implicated in the records. Maggie sipped her tea thoughtfully. What other options do we have? We could approach this more strategically, Dr. Martinez suggested. Properly document everything, have the materials authenticated by experts, and create secure copies before making anything public. That would provide protection against destruction or tampering with the evidence, but it would take time during which you might remain vulnerable to pressure. She paused, considering another angle. There's also a third option, approaching this as a negotiation rather than a confrontation. The Wilsons clearly want these materials suppressed, but they might be willing to make significant concessions to achieve that goal. Maggie frowned. You mean blackmail them? I didn't survive bankruptcy and illness just to become an extortionist. Dr. Martinez shook her head quickly. Not blackmail, negotiation for historical preservation. For example, they might agree to fund the complete restoration of the Sunrise Diner as a historical landmark, with the Speakeasy preserved as a museum space documenting Prohibition-era history. The ledgers could be donated to an academic archive with certain names redacted or under seal for a specified period. That would preserve the historical significance without immediately destroying reputations. Maggie mused, seeing the potential. Exactly. It would give the Wilsons a face-saving way to address their family's past while contributing to historical preservation. And it would give you a restored diner where you could potentially live and work, turning your $300 investment into a sustainable future. They stayed up late into the night, examining the materials more thoroughly and developing a plan. Dr. Martinez photographed every page of the ledgers and every photograph, creating digital backups that she stored in a password-protected cloud account. They prepared a detailed inventory of everything Maggie had removed from the speakeasy, including descriptions of items still in the underground space. By morning, they had outlined a comprehensive approach that balanced historical preservation, Maggie's personal security, and practical considerations about confronting Riverdale's power structure. Over breakfast, Dr. Martinez made several phone calls to colleagues, a legal historian at the State University, an archivist specializing in Prohibition-era materials, and a lawyer experienced in historical preservation cases. Each agreed to meet with them later that day to provide specialized guidance. Maggie's phone had remained silent since Wilson's threatening text the previous night, but as she and Dr. Martinez prepared to leave for their first meeting, she received a call from an unlisted number. Miss Foster? This is Sheriff Robert Taylor. The voice was official but not unfriendly. I need to speak with you regarding a complaint filed by Frank Wilson of trespassing and theft at the Sunrise Diner property. Maggie felt a surge of anxiety. Sheriff Taylor, I'm the legal owner of that property. I purchased it at the county auction 2 days ago. I have the deed. I understand that, ma'am, the sheriff replied. But Mr. Wilson claims that you removed historical artifacts that were not included in the property sale, as they belonged to his family and were merely stored at that location. He's filed a formal complaint, and I need to take your statement. Dr. Martinez, listening to Maggie's side of the conversation, quickly wrote a note and passed it across the table. Ask if he has a warrant. If not, agree to meet at a public place. Following the historian's advice, Maggie asked, "Do you have a warrant, Sheriff?" "No, ma'am, not at this point. This is just a preliminary investigation. I'm happy to meet with you to discuss this matter," Maggie said carefully. "Perhaps at the Riverdale coffee shop in an hour." The sheriff agreed, and Maggie ended the call, looking to Dr. Martinez with concern. "The Wilsons are using their influence with local law enforcement," the historian observed. "Not surprising, but it confirms they're willing to escalate this situation. We need to accelerate our timeline." They quickly modified their plans, prioritizing their meeting with the lawyer before seeing the sheriff. Dr. Martinez called her legal contact, explaining the urgency, and the attorney agreed to meet them immediately at her office. Catherine Simmons was a formidable woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating complex legal battles. Her office, located in a converted Victorian house near the courthouse, was filled with law books and historical documents related to property rights. After hearing their story and examining samples of the materials, Attorney Simmons provided clear guidance. From a legal standpoint, these materials belonged to Thomas Sullivan, who became Harold Jenkins. They were on property you legally purchased, concealed in a space that was not disclosed in any property records. The Wilsons have no legitimate claim to them, she explained. However, she continued, legal right and practical reality are often different things. The Wilsons have substantial influence in this community, including with law enforcement and the judiciary. Fighting them directly could be both expensive and potentially dangerous. Attorney Simmons suggested a two-pronged approach. First, we file for an emergency injunction preventing anyone from altering the speakeasy space, citing its historical significance. That gives legal protection to the physical site. Second, we deposit the ledgers and other portable materials with the State Historical Society as a temporary research loan while ownership is determined. That places them under institutional protection beyond local influence. With a clear legal strategy in place, Maggie felt more confident as she prepared to meet Sheriff Taylor. Dr. Martinez insisted on accompanying her, bringing Attorney Simmons along as well. The Riverdale coffee shop was busy with the late morning crowd when they arrived. Sheriff Taylor was already seated at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He seemed surprised to see Maggie arrive with companions. "Sheriff Taylor, this is Dr. Eleanor Martinez from the college, a historical preservation expert, and Catherine Simmons, my attorney," Maggie introduced them as they sat down. The sheriff's expression shifted slightly, recognizing that this would not be the easy intimidation he might have expected. "Miss Foster, I'm just trying to sort out a civil dispute here. Mr. Wilson claims that family heirlooms were stored in that building with the previous owner's permission." Attorney Simmons spoke before Maggie could respond. "Sheriff, my client legally purchased that property and all contents not specifically excluded in the auction documentation. No personal property claims were filed during the required notice period before the auction. If Mr. Wilson wishes to make a claim now, he can file a civil suit, but there are no grounds for criminal allegations." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. Mr. Wilson provided photographs of items he claims were in the building, specifically some old books and photographs he says belonged to his grandfather. "Interesting," Dr. Martinez interjected. "I'd very much like to see those photographs, as they might help authenticate the historical materials my institution is evaluating for potential preservation." Her strategic redirection worked perfectly, shifting the conversation from accusations of theft to questions of historical significance, an area where the sheriff was clearly out of his depth. "Look," Sheriff Taylor said after an awkward pause, "I'm just doing my job following up on a complaint. If this is a civil matter between Mr. Wilson and Miss Foster, I'll note that in my report and let the courts handle it." After the sheriff departed, Attorney Simmons smiled appreciatively at Dr. Martinez. "Nicely done. You've established that we know about the materials, are treating them as historically significant, and have professional expertise on our side. That makes it harder for them to pursue this as a simple theft case." They proceeded immediately to the county courthouse, where Attorney Simmons filed for an emergency preservation order to protect the speakeasy site, citing its unique historical significance. The judge on duty, fortunately not one with known connections to the Wilson family, granted a temporary order preventing any alteration of the property, pending a full hearing. Their next stop was the State Historical Society's regional office, where Dr. Martinez had arranged a meeting with the director, Dr. William Chen. After examining the ledgers and photographs, Dr. Chen was visibly excited by their historical significance. "This is precisely the kind of material our Prohibition-Era collection has been missing," he explained. "We have physical artifacts, bottles, bar equipment, even a reconstructed speakeasy, but very few documentary records of how these establishments actually operated and influenced their communities." He readily agreed to accept the materials as a research deposit, with proper climate-controlled storage and security measures, providing Maggie with official documentation of the arrangement that specified she retained ownership rights pending any legal determinations. With the physical evidence secured and the speakeasy site protected by court order, Maggie felt her first real sense of relief since discovering the hidden room. They returned to Dr. Martinez's home to develop the next phase of their strategy. "We've secured the evidence and established legal protection for the site," Attorney Simmons summarized. "Now we need to consider how to approach the Wilsons. Based on their actions so far, they'll continue applying pressure through whatever channels they control." Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. "I think we should reach out proactively with our proposal for historical preservation that allows them to participate in contextualizing their family's history rather than simply being exposed by it." Maggie considered this approach. "So instead of threatening exposure, we offer them a chance to control the narrative, to acknowledge their family's complicated past, while emphasizing their contemporary contributions to the community?" "Exactly," Dr. Martinez confirmed. "Many families with Prohibition-era wealth have successfully managed this transition. The Kennedys are perhaps the most famous example. Joseph Kennedy's fortune had roots in bootlegging, but the family later embraced a narrative of public service and philanthropy." Attorney Simmons drafted a careful letter to Frank Wilson, outlining a proposal for collaborative historical preservation. Wilson Development would fund the restoration of the Sunrise Diner as a functioning restaurant with the speakeasy preserved as a historical exhibit. The ledgers and other documents would be donated to the State Historical Society with a 25-year seal on certain names, and Maggie would receive a life interest in the property as its resident manager. As they finalized the letter, Maggie's phone rang Frank Wilson himself. "Miss Foster," he began without preamble, "this situation has gotten out of hand. I understand you've filed for a preservation order on the property and deposited certain materials with the Historical Society." Maggie was surprised by how quickly he'd learned of their actions, but she maintained her composure. "Yes, Mr. Wilson. Given the historical significance of what I discovered, it seemed appropriate to ensure proper preservation while any ownership questions are resolved." There was a pause before Wilson continued, his tone shifting from confrontational to cautiously diplomatic. "Perhaps we've gotten off on the wrong foot. My family has a long-standing interest in Riverdale's history, including some complicated aspects of that history during Prohibition. I'd like to discuss a potential partnership that would serve both our interests and the community's historical awareness." Maggie caught Dr. Martinez's eye, both of them recognizing that Wilson was already pivoting toward the very approach they had been planning to propose. "I'd be open to that discussion, Mr. Wilson," Maggie replied carefully. "I believe there's an opportunity here to create something valuable for the community." While acknowledging complex historical truths, they arranged to meet the following day at Attorney Simmons's office, with Dr. Martinez and Dr. Chun from the Historical Society also attending to provide expert perspective on the 5E, historical preservation aspects of any agreement. After ending the call, Maggie sat back, a mixture of relief and wariness washing over her. "He's changing his approach completely." "Because you changed the power dynamic," Attorney Simmons observed. "By securing the evidence and obtaining legal protection for the site, you've removed his option to simply make everything disappear. Now he's looking for the best possible outcome within the new reality." Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. "This is how real change often happens, not through dramatic confrontation, but through leveraging moments of vulnerability to create new possibilities that all parties can accept, even if reluctantly." That evening, Maggie returned to the diner for the first time since her hasty departure. The preservation order meant that no one could interfere with the property, and she felt a need to reconnect with the space that had unexpectedly transformed her life. The building stood quiet in the fading light, its weathered exterior unchanged but somehow different in Maggie's eyes. What had initially been merely affordable shelter had become a nexus of history, power, and possibility, a place where past and present intersected in ways that might reshape the future. As she walked through the main dining area toward the concealed trapdoor, Maggie reflected on the strange journey that had brought her here. Her medical crisis and subsequent bankruptcy had seemed like the end of everything she had worked for. A catastrophic loss that had left her with nothing but debt and desperation. Yet without that series of devastating setbacks, she would never have found herself at the county auction, bidding her last $300 on an abandoned diner. She would never have discovered the hidden speakeasy with its damning historical evidence. She would never have had the opportunity to not only rebuild her own life, but potentially contribute to a more honest reckoning with the town's history. Sometimes Maggie realized what appears to be our greatest loss becomes the doorway to unexpected purpose. The floor that collapses beneath our feet may reveal treasures we never suspected existed. The path forward rarely looks like the one we imagined, but it might lead to destinations more meaningful than those we had planned. As she carefully lifted the trapdoor and descended the stairs to the speakeasy, Maggie felt a profound sense of connection to Thomas Sullivan, who had hidden his illegal operation here nearly a century ago. Like her, he had faced difficult circumstances and made complicated choices. Like her, he had reinvented himself when necessary, becoming Harold Jenkins after Prohibition to create a new chapter in his life. The speakeasy looked different now that she understood its significance. Not just a historical curiosity, but a physical manifestation of how power and influence had been negotiated in Riverdale for generations. The bar where deals were made. The tables where secrets were shared. The ledgers where transactions were recorded. It all had shaped the town in ways that continued to resonate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she faced Frank Wilson across a negotiating table, rather than as an adversary in a legal battle. But tonight, in the quiet of this hidden historical space, Maggie found herself filled with unexpected hope. From the depths of her personal crisis had emerged an opportunity not just for individual recovery, but for community transformation, a chance to acknowledge buried truths, while creating something valuable for the future. The woman who had lost everything was discovering that empty hands are sometimes the most ready to receive new possibilities. The journey that had begun in desperation was evolving into something she could never have anticipated, a path toward not just survival, but significance. The morning of the meeting with Frank Wilson dawned clear and bright, a welcome change from the rain that had dominated the previous days. Maggie woke early in Dr. Martinez's guest room, feeling a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Today could determine not just her own future, but the way Riverdale would reckon with its complex past. Over breakfast, she reviewed their strategy once more with Dr. Martinez and Attorney Simmons, who had arrived early to prepare. "Remember," Attorney Simmons advised, "we're approaching this as a negotiation where all parties can benefit, not as an adversarial confrontation. Wilson will be looking for ways to protect his family's reputation while minimizing financial and social costs. Our job is to find the intersection between his interests and historical preservation." Dr. Martinez nodded in agreement. The fact that he requested this meeting and spoke of partnership suggests he's already moving in this direction. He's a businessman. He calculates risks and returns. Our preservation proposal offers him a better return than continued conflict. Maggie took a deep breath, centering herself. "And what about my role in all this? 2 days ago, I was just a broke former cook living in a motel. Now I'm negotiating with the most powerful man in town over historical secrets that could reshape Riverdale." "That's precisely why you're essential to this process," Dr. Martinez said firmly. "You bring a perspective unclouded by institutional allegiances or political considerations. You found these materials not because you were looking for leverage or academic recognition, but because you were simply trying to rebuild your life. That gives you moral authority that neither Wilson nor even historical experts like myself can claim." They arrived at Attorney Simmons's office 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting time, using the opportunity to arrange the conference room strategically. Dr. Chun from the State Historical Society joined them, bringing professionally prepared assessment documents detailing the historical significance of the speakeasy and its contents. Frank Wilson arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a single associate whom he introduced as James Porter, his company's legal counsel. Wilson himself was a tall, distinguished-looking man in his early 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that communicated wealth without ostentation. His demeanor was controlled and professional, though Maggie noticed the tension around his eyes as he took in the assembled group. After brief introductions, Attorney Simmons opened the discussion. "Mr. Wilson, we appreciate your willingness to meet and discuss a collaborative approach to the historical materials Miss Foster discovered at the Sunrise Diner property. We believe there's an opportunity here that serves multiple interests: historical preservation, community education, and respectful handling of complex family legacies." Wilson nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "I agree that collaboration is preferable to conflict. My family has been part of Riverdale's development for generations, and we take our role in the community seriously. However, I have concerns about how certain historical materials might be contextualized or presented." Dr. Chun stepped forward, spreading photographs of the speakeasy across the table. "Mr. Wilson, speaking as a historical preservationist, what Ms. Foster has discovered is extraordinarily rare: a completely intact Prohibition-era speakeasy with extensive documentary evidence of its operations. From a purely historical perspective, this is a nationally significant find." Wilson studied the photographs, his expression softening slightly with what appeared to be genuine interest. "My grandfather spoke of these places, though never in detail. He was a complicated man living in complicated times. That's precisely the framework we envision for preserving this history," Dr. Martinez interjected. "Not as a simplistic moral judgment, but as an exploration of how Prohibition created complex moral and economic situations that shaped communities for generations afterward." For the next hour, they discussed various approaches to preservation, with Wilson gradually revealing his primary concerns: protecting his family from being uniquely associated with illegal activities that were common during that era, and ensuring that any public presentation balanced historical accuracy with appropriate context. "My grandfather was no saint," Wilson acknowledged at one point, surprising them with his candor. "But neither was he unique in how he operated during Prohibition. Virtually every successful family from that period has similar chapters in there. History, though most lacked the detailed documentation Miss Foster has discovered. Maggie, who had been quietly observing the dynamic, chose this moment to speak. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't come to Riverdale looking for historical secrets or trying to challenge anyone's legacy. I bought that diner because I needed a place to live. After medical bankruptcy took everything I had. What I found was unexpected, but I believe it belongs to the community's shared history, not just to me or to your family." Wilson studied her thoughtfully. "Medical bankruptcy? Unfortunately, that's a story I hear too often. Our healthcare system fails too many hardworking people." He paused, seeming to make a decision. "Miss Foster, what's your background?" "Before the medical issues, I was a cook," Maggie replied simply. 15 years experience, specialized in traditional American comfort food. I was good at it, had regular customers who came specifically for my cooking. I taught cooking classes at the community center too, helping people with limited budgets learn to prepare healthy, affordable meals. Something shifted in Wilson's expression, a calculation being made, possibilities considered. "The Sunrise Diner was once a community institution. My grandfather, both as Sullivan and later as Jenkins, understood that a good restaurant is more than just a business. It's a gathering place that shapes community identity." He turned to his attorney, had a brief whispered consultation, then addressed the group with new purpose. "I'd like to propose an alternative approach. Wilson Development will fund the complete restoration of the Sunrise Diner to its original 1950s condition, with the speakeasy preserved as a historical exhibit open to researchers and limited public tours. Miss Foster would receive a lifetime lease at nominal rent to operate the restaurant portion, with profit sharing rather than traditional rent payments." The proposal caught them by surprise, particularly the specific inclusion of Maggie as the diner's operator. "The documentary materials," Wilson continued, "would be donated to the State Historical Society with appropriate contextual research. Support funded by my company. Names in the ledgers would remain accessible to legitimate researchers, but would not be highlighted in public exhibitions, without proper historical context explaining the widespread nature of such arrangements during Prohibition." Dr. Martinez and Attorney Simmons exchanged glances, recognizing that Wilson was offering essentially what they had planned to propose, but with the additional element of Maggie actively operating the restored diner. "That's a generous proposal," Attorney Simmons said carefully. "However, Miss Foster would need business startup support beyond just the building restoration kitchen equipment, initial inventory, staffing costs during the establishment period." Wilson nodded immediately. "Of course, a business development grant of $150,000, structured as a forgivable loan contingent on the diner operating for at least 5 years. Plus consultation support from our restaurant division for business planning and launch." As the details were discussed, Maggie felt a surreal sense of transformation. In the space of a single meeting, she had gone from owning an uninhabitable building to potentially operating a fully restored historic diner with substantial financial backing. Her culinary skills and experience, which had seemed irrelevant to her current circumstances, were suddenly central to a solution that served multiple interests: historical preservation, community revival, and her own professional rebirth. After 2 hours of detailed negotiation, they reached an agreement in principle that satisfied all parties. Legal documents would be drawn up over the coming week, but the core arrangement was clear. The Sunrise Diner would be restored both as a functioning restaurant and as a historical site, with the speakeasy preserved as a carefully contextualized exhibit documenting an important, but often hidden aspect of American history. As they prepared to conclude the meeting, Frank Wilson made a final observation that surprised everyone with its philosophical tone. "You know, my grandfather used to say that Prohibition created opportunities for people who understood that every crisis reshapes the rules." I've always interpreted that as entrepreneurial wisdom, seeing possibility where others see only constraints. But perhaps there was a deeper meaning too. When established systems fail, new paths emerge, sometimes leading to unexpected destinations. He looked directly at Maggie. You came to Riverdale because our healthcare system failed you, a modern prohibition of sorts, denying essential services to those who can't afford them. You found shelter in a building my grandfather built after reinventing himself when another prohibition ended. Now you'll reinvent that space again, preserving its complicated history while creating something new. There's a certain symmetry to it that I suspect both Thomas Sullivan and Harold Jenkins would appreciate. With the formal meeting concluded, they moved to the office's reception area. As they gathered their materials, Dr. Martinez quietly remarked, "To Maggie, he's trying to create a narrative he can live with, one where his family's complicated past becomes part of a larger American story about resilience and reinvention." "Isn't that what we all do?" Maggie replied. "Find ways to make sense of our past while building something meaningful for the future." The next 6 months transformed both Maggie's life and the Sunrise Diner beyond anything she could have imagined. That rainy day when she'd first turned the key in its neglected door. The restoration proceeded under the guidance of historical preservation experts, with Wilson Development providing funding far beyond their original estimates as the project gained momentum and community support. The exterior was meticulously returned to its 1950s glory, gleaming stainless steel, restored neon signage, and the distinctive curved roof that had characterized the post-war optimism of the original design. Inside, the main dining area was rebuilt with authentic materials, black and white checkered flooring, red vinyl booth seating, chrome-edged tables, and the long counter with classic swivel stools. Behind the counter, the kitchen was equipped with modern appliances that maintained the vintage aesthetic while meeting contemporary health codes and efficiency standards. The speakeasy beneath received equally careful attention, though with a different purpose. Conservationists stabilized the space, preserving the bar, furnishings, and atmosphere while installing climate control systems to protect the historical materials. Display cases were added to exhibit artifacts discovered during the restoration, bottles, glassware, and reproductions of selected ledger pages with appropriate historical context, provided by Dr. Martinez and her colleagues. Most remarkably, the restoration process itself became a community event. As word spread about the hidden speakeasy and plans for the diner's revival, Riverdale residents began sharing family stories and photographs connected to both the original Riverdale Cafe and the later Sunrise Diner. Elderly citizens who remembered Harold Jenkins came forward with memories of his cooking and hospitality. Families discovered that their grandparents had been mentioned in Sullivan's ledgers, leading to complicated but ultimately healing conversations about the realities of Prohibition-era life. Frank Wilson, recognizing the positive public response, expanded his involvement beyond the initial agreement. He established a Riverdale Historical Preservation Fund, with the Sunrise Diner as its first project, but with plans to support other restoration efforts throughout the town. What had begun as an attempt to manage potential reputation damage evolved into a genuine commitment to community heritage. For Maggie, the months of restoration provided an unexpected opportunity for personal and professional recovery. With the pressure of immediate housing needs resolved by the agreement with Wilson, she could focus on developing a business plan for the diner's reopening. She enrolled in business management courses at the community college, where Dr. Martinez introduced her to other faculty with expertise in small business development. The $150,000 startup grant allowed Maggie to hire and train local staff, develop a menu that honored the diner's traditional offerings while incorporating contemporary tastes, and create a marketing strategy that emphasized both the historical significance of the space and the quality of the food. She reconnected with farmers and suppliers she had known during her previous cooking career, building a network of local food sources that would distinguish the Sunrise from chain restaurants. Throughout this period, Maggie lived in the apartment above the diner, overseeing the restoration and planning for opening day. The space had been beautifully renovated while maintaining its historical character, hardwood floors refinished, built-in features restored, windows replaced with period-appropriate designs that incorporated modern energy efficiency. What had initially been a desperate last resort had become a home that reflected both her personal taste and the building's heritage. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Maggie had purchased the abandoned building at auction, the Sunrise Diner officially reopened to the public. A red ribbon stretched across the entrance, with Maggie and Frank Wilson positioned on either side, scissors in hand for the ceremonial cutting. A crowd of Riverdale residents gathered in the parking lot, their excited chatter creating a festive atmosphere. Dr. Martinez stood nearby, beaming with pride at what their unlikely partnership had accomplished. Attorney Simmons had brought her entire office staff to celebrate their part in the legal framework that had made the restoration possible. Dr. Chun represented the State Historical Society, which had created a special exhibition about the diner and speakeasy as examples of hidden history being reclaimed for public understanding. As Maggie prepared to cut the ribbon, she took a moment to address the assembled community. "A year ago, I came to Riverdale with nothing but debt and desperation after a medical crisis took everything I had. I bought this abandoned diner with my last $300, just looking for shelter. What I found instead was a hidden piece of history that connected me to this community in ways I never could have imagined." She gestured toward the beautifully restored building behind her. The Sunrise Diner has always been more than just a restaurant. For generations, it's been a place where this community comes together to share meals, celebrate milestones, support each other through difficult times, and create the everyday connections that make a collection of buildings into a true hometown. Maggie glanced at Frank Wilson, acknowledging his contribution with a respectful nod. "The history beneath our feet is complicated, a reminder that every community is built on complex, human stories that include both struggles and triumphs. By preserving that history honestly while creating something new to serve today's community, we honor both our past and our future." She raised the scissors to the ribbon. "The Sunrise Diner welcomes you back to good food, good company, and the continuing story of Riverdale that we all write together." As the ribbon fell and the crowd cheered, Maggie felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun in loss and desperation had led to something she could never have planned or anticipated, not just personal recovery, but a contribution to community healing and historical truth. The diner filled quickly with excited patrons eager to experience both the restored space and Maggie's renowned cooking. The classic comfort food menu featuring her famous pies, alongside traditional diner fare prepared with local ingredients, and expert technique received enthusiastic approval. The displays explaining the building's dual history as both the Sunrise Diner and Sullivan's Speakeasy attracted curious examination, with many visitors discovering connections to their own family stories. Throughout that first day, Maggie moved between the kitchen and dining area, greeting customers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. In quiet moments, she found herself reflecting on the strange series of events that had brought her to this point. The medical crisis that had seemed like the end of everything had ultimately led her to a new beginning she could never have imagined. The bankruptcy that had stripped away her possessions had positioned her to discover historical treasures of immense value. The desperate purchase of an abandoned building had connected her to a community's hidden past and created possibilities for its future. Late that evening, after the last customers had departed and the staff had completed closing procedures, Maggie sat alone at the counter with a cup of coffee, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a successful opening day. The diner felt alive again, surfaces gleaming, the air carrying the lingering aromas of good food. the space humming with the energy of human connections renewed. A soft knock at the door interrupted her reverie. Dr. Martinez stood outside, holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. Maggie let her in with a warm embrace. "I couldn't stay away," the historian admitted, settling onto a stool beside. "Maggie, I wanted to see how you were feeling after such a momentous day." "Overwhelmed, but in the best possible way," Maggie replied honestly. "A year ago, I was counting pennies to buy ramen noodles at the convenience store. Today I served pie to half the town in a restaurant that somehow belongs both to Riverdale's history and to me. It doesn't quite seem real." Dr. Martinez smiled, pushing the package across the counter. "This might help it feel more concrete. A small opening day gift." Maggie unwrapped the package to find a framed photograph she'd never seen before. A black and white image of Thomas Sullivan standing proudly in front of the original Riverdale Cafe in 1918. His expression one of determined hope despite the uncertainty of the times he lived in. "Where did you find this?" Maggie asked, tracing the frame with gentle fingers. "In the County Historical Archives. It was misfiled for decades until our research brought attention to Sullivan's story. I thought you should have it a reminder of how places like this are built on individual courage and reinvention, generation after generation." Maggie studied the photograph, seeing in Sullivan's face the same mix of determination and vulnerability she had felt when purchasing the abandoned diner with her last resources. He took a chance on Riverdale when his future was uncertain, just like I did. And like him, you've created something that serves not just your own needs, but the community's, Dr. Martinez observed. Though hopefully with fewer illegal liquor sales. They laughed together, the shared joke representing how far they'd come in navigating the complicated historical legacy they'd uncovered. As Dr. Martinez prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "You know, historians often talk about how crises reshape society's wars, economic depressions, prohibitions of various kinds. But we sometimes forget how those same forces reshape individual lives, creating both destruction and possibility. Your journey this past year is a powerful reminder that history isn't just about the past. It's about how we use the past to create new futures." After the historian departed, Maggie returned to the counter, placing Sullivan's photograph beside the vintage cash register where it seemed to belong, a visual connection between past and present, between crisis and reinvention, between what is lost and what might yet be built. The woman who had once lost everything now possessed something beyond mere ownership, a place in a community's ongoing story, a purpose that honored both personal resilience and shared heritage, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes our greatest losses lead us not to despair, but to discoveries that transform not just our own lives, but the lives of those around us. The Sunrise Diner stood once again as a beacon in Riverdale, its neon sign glowing in the darkness, its windows offering glimpses of warmth and welcome to passers-by, its foundations built upon complicated truths now acknowledged rather than buried. And Maggie Foster, once bankrupted by medical debt and desperate for mere shelter, had become not just the diner's owner, but the keeper of its stories, the creator of its future, and living proof that even the most devastating collapse can reveal treasures we never expected to find. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.